Bad Ideas Production, and today we're going to talk about the importance of opening scenes in horror movies. Why I'm going to talk about specifically about horror movies is because one, I love horror movies, and secondly, I think they're the most affected by genre. We can see and we could tell what kind of movie we're going to watch because of the opening scene if it's done correctly. Let's start with example number one. In one of my favorite movies of all time, Scream, we know it's a slasher film, right? The opening basically boils down to a killer stalking a girl and then killing her. This format can be seen all throughout slashers. Now, don't get me wrong. In Scream, there's a lot of in between where we get the meta commentary. And another one of my favorite horror movies, Halloween, the same idea. We get a stalker killing their victim. Now, like I said, in the in between, we get the realization, the surprise at the end of the opening scene, where we find out that it's a little boy in a little clown costume killed his sister, and we also find out that how a killer could be anybody, even someone in Middle America. Halloween laid the foundation that would later be, experimented with, tampered with, in other films in the future, but you know when you're gonna get a slasher film. We established the theme of the movie. We established the amount of gore. Some horror movies, some slasher films, especially in the early 2000s, weren't really that bloody, other than the gore porns like the Hostels and Saws. But a lot of times we got a lot of PG-13 horror movies where we didn't see that much blood. We would see the killer, and unless it was the 80s, we really didn't see that much attention to gore. It's been a long time since we had a mascot killer really bring gore and violence into the big screen. Now, as there's many subgenres within the umbrella of horror, one of the more popular one is supernatural horror, where essentially there's a curse, which I like to call it, and the protagonist has to figure out how to, get rid of this curse or find a loophole within this curse. One of the best templates for an opening scene of this genre is The Ring. We start this movie and it's two girls and they come home after school. It seems as they're wearing school outfits. So we're introduced to this curse, and then we're introduced to rules of said curse, which if the movie's worth its salt, it does. It establishes these things within the first 5 minutes, 6 minutes of the film. If you watch this VHS film, you will get a call, and then it will say 7 days, and then in 7 days you die, and that's exactly what happens in this opening, where one of the characters watches the film. She watched it 7 days previous. So tonight is the day she dies, and that's exactly what happens. And then we see how she dies, where her face is all mangled and it's kind of like deformed and whatever. Seems like her soul is sucked out of her body. And then we're introduced to the main character of the movie, and obviously she's gonna watch the movie, or someone's gonna watch the movie. I think her kid ends up watching it. Oh, she ends up watching it, then her kid ends up watching it, and then they have to figure out how to beat this curse. Another movie that's kind of like this is The Grudge, and it's funny because I actually enjoy the American versions of these movies more than I like the Japanese version of the movies. Which I don't know if that's like a hot take, but now there's some movies where they're very in the horror genre, they're very experimental, and they don't really follow a template or a beat sheet or a structure that can be put into other movies of that genre, because they're just so experimental, right? They're trying new things, such as Long Legs, It Follows, the Babadook. All these movies are kind of seen as elevated horror, or even Hereditary, where the beginning isn't something that we've seen before. It's something that it's very artistic, and A24 like is Long Legs, where this is more of a detective horror mystery, about there's a serial killer and detectives have to find it, right? Find them. And in the beginning, the opening scene of this movie is our introduction to the serial killer. That scene's a flashback, and we just get little glimpses of what that scene actually means as the movie goes. And that's just a weird way of doing intro scenes where we're not establishing much other than the main villain. I think the Babadook does a great job of being a stylized and symbolic movie, and that's captured very well in the beginning of that movie, because we we start off with the main character in her car when her husband's driving it, and then we see that there was a car accident and that presumably killed her husband, and then she wakes up as a dream, and then now we're introduced to the theme of this movie, that's trauma, and it's about depression and how she's gonna deal with the aftermath of the grief that she's dealing with. And then and the whole movie is just kind of a metaphor to dealing with that trauma. Another one that does this very well, but does it kind of more in a more formulaic way, is It Follows, where we begin with this girl. She's just running away from something. We don't see what it is. She's running away from something, and then we cut, and she's at the beach, and she's talking about how she loves her mom and her dad, and she's apologizing, whatever. And then we cut to the next morning, and she's dead, brutally murdered. So now we see what the curse is and what it's gonna do, but we don't understand 100% everything, and that the movie does the rest for us, right? That's like an idea of something that could be replicated in other films that want to be more stylized. I personally put them into a category of horror movies about trauma. There's so many of them, like Talk to Me, The Descent, Carrie, and The Lodge. The beginning of the movie, we're literally shown the traumatic event that leads to the events of the rest of the movie. So, for example, The Descent, right? The Descent is about this movie where the protagonist, where this girl and her friends go to cave diving, and they run into a bunch of monsters that try to kill them. So the beginning of that movie shows us that she was with her family and friends. They're having a great time. As they're driving home, they get in a car accident, and the wife loses her husband and her son. And then she has to deal with that trauma throughout the movie, right? And it's kind of like a metaphor of her overcoming this pitfall in her life. This very sad time that she's dealing with. So same thing with the movie Carrie. Uh, we're shown that she gets bullied in the beginning of the movie when she has her period in the shower, and and then all this leads up to the big final where she becomes evil and vengeful. Horror is the only genre that I know where the opening scene is so impactful for the rest of the movie. It literally hooks us in more than any other genre. So in other words, I love horror movie openings because they're very versatile. A lot of times they're very structured, and kind of you know what you're getting yourself into when you watch one. You know what kind of movie you get into. It just tells you. It gets straight to the point. It establishes the themes, establishes the characters, the killer, the entity, the ghost, the monster, the whatever we're gonna deal with for the rest of the movies, the rules. Maybe even sometimes we get a little foreshadowing of how to kill the monster or defeat the evil. And I just don't think any other genre does this to the extent that horror does. And yeah, Bad Ideas Production.